Good morning, everybody. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked our base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, on this date, December 8th, Franklin Roosevelt addressed the Congress and called December 7 a date which will live in infamy. By the way, I'm on Old Douglas County. Our town was established in 1747. When Commodore Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Japan in 1853, as pictured here, this made a big impression on the Japanese. And a couple of years later, they started their own naval training center in Nagasaki, thus telling the world that they were pretty serious about having a strong navy and being a Pacific power. In 1894, Japan fought the Chinese over raw materials, among other things. And in the early 1900s, Japan fought the Russians over the region of Korea and Northeast China, and Japan was successful. After World War I, the League of Nations gave Japan the area to the east of the Philippines. Here it's called the Japanese Mandate, and Japan proceeded to fortify those islands, and there was some pretty fierce fighting there in World War II. In the 1920s, Japan created their first aircraft carrier. But most of the great naval powers at the time were still focused on what were called capital ships, battle cruisers, etc. And in 1922, the major naval powers signed the Five-Power Treaty, in which they agreed to limit the size and the number of their ships. And you'll note that Japan agreed to a smaller number of ships than the Americans and the British. Well, this book, The American Black Chamber by Herbert Yardley, describes how American code breakers broke the Japanese code and knew that Japan would back down if pushed, and that's what happened. In 1931, Japan invaded China, and this was the beginning of a multi-year attempt to conquer China. Japan committed millions of soldiers to that vast country. It was quite a drain on Japanese manpower, and it did reveal how weak the League of Nations was. League of Nations did not prevent any of the aggression that led to World War II. In 1937, the Japanese, having withdrawn from the naval treaty, built this ship and one other like it. These were the largest battleships ever built. And Japan was planning on a big naval battle with the United States. In 1937, Japanese flyers sunk an American ship that was in the Yangtze River, the Panay. Japan apologized. We were not up for war. We were very isolationist, and the incident passed from the newspapers. And the next year, in 1938, all the powers, large and small, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which all nations agreed not to go to war anymore. And all the warring nations of World War II had signed that pact. In the summer of 1939, Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to change the Neutrality Acts. FDR was worried, particularly about Britain, and most Americans started to be afraid of what were called the Axis powers. And war was on the horizon, so it was time to think about that. In the summer of 1941, the United States suspended trade with Japan. It froze Japanese assets in the United States. And everybody in the country that summer and fall expected war with Japan in 1941. The Japanese government sent 2 emissaries to the United States to try to come up with some kind of negotiations or something to lessen tension. And even as they were talking, the Japanese Navy was getting ready on an obscure island in the northern part of the Japanese islands for its attack on Pearl Harbor. And this map shows the route of the Japanese attack force as it approached Hawaii from the north. And here's a picture from a Japanese warplane, December 7, 1941, when our base was attacked in Hawaii. And here's our event for today. Franklin Roosevelt, the day after Pearl Harbor, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy.